Hey everybody, welcome to Monster Monday for March 22nd, 2021. I am your host, DM Gallibond, and today we are going to be looking at our second in a multi-part series on the history of goblins. This is the History of Goblins Part 2, the Goblinoids. And when I talk about Goblinoids, I mean all of those things that get the tag Goblinoid in the monster manual and the other sources, but they're not actually full-blooded goblins. There's reasons that some things get Goblinoid tags, and we'll talk about some of that tonight. And later on, when we talk about the religion and the culture of goblins, some of those things will become even more clear. But we'll touch on a little bit of that tonight because we have to understand where these goblinoids come from. And I have to tell you, folks, there are a boatload. A virtual boatload. I mean, you could take a Disney cruise with all the different types of goblinoids that there are in D&D. It is just insane the number of different goblinoid types there are. Before we get started, I just want to go ahead and make a big shout out to Mo over at the Tabletop Bellhop. He is the OG when it comes to everything to do with tabletop games, board games, card games, party games, you name it, he's got it over there, and all kinds of different links to buy games, to keep up with industry news, podcasts, and everything else that you can imagine about games. So go check him out at tabletopbellhop.com. All right, so tonight we are going to be looking at goblinoids, and yes, the creature you are looking at is a type of goblinoid. It's actually a Hobgoblin Iron Shadow, that we will look at a little bit later on. There's so many different types of goblinoids that I had to classify them 3 different ways. There's the common goblinoids, the rare goblinoids, and then just the downright strange goblinoids that are part of the multiverse. If we want to look at the common goblinoids, those include the hobgoblins and the bugbears. Rarer goblinoids include creatures like the Bakemono, the Koalinth, the Norker, and the Varag. And the really strange and sometimes creepy goblinoids include Thules, Nilbogs, Worghests, and Barghest. Now, some of you who are a little bit up on your D&D lore may say, wait a minute. No, some of those don't seem like goblinoids. But they have the goblinoid tag, so therefore they fall into this. They may share other tags, but they are considered goblinoids at least by virtue of the monster manual, and therefore they qualify, in my opinion, for this series. And we are going to talk about them because populating your campaign that we're going to talk about in the last part of this series, where we build an entire campaign with goblins as your antagonists, those goblinoids are going to come into play there. All right. So goblinoid lore. And we're even breaking down goblinoid lore to just the origins. So some goblinoids are purported to be natural variations of goblins, branches of a similar evolutionary tree. So you might think of how in Earth evolution, they talk about the apes as a family, and as a family of primates, and at some point they diverged, and you wound up having one branch that became chimpanzees, one branch that became gorillas, and one branch that became human beings. So it's the same primate family, but then they branched out. So think of goblinoids that evolved naturally into different forms as that kind of variation. So hobgoblins and bugbears are the ones that are considered to fall into that category. Now, there are rarer variants that are from distant realms or different climates, such as the aquatic Koalinth, which is the creature we see here, and the distant Bakemono. The Bakemono is the oriental goblin, and in the continent or in the world of Toril, where the Forgotten Realms is set, you'll find them over in far distant Karatur. Now, Karatur hasn't been mentioned a lot in 5e yet, and so that's where you have to go back to some older versions of D&D to find things like that. Now, still others, and this is where we get into the downright strange, are the results of wizard meddling like Thules, or even curses of the gods, and that's where you get the Barghests from. So we're going to talk a bit more as we look into each of the different types of goblinoids. Now, you know this. This is our creature type slide, where we always talk about creature types, and just like goblins proper, all goblinoids are humanoids. So if you need a refresher on that, you can go back to last week's episode and watch what we said about humanoids. Okay, now, normally I have one slide that talks about the mechanical features of the monster, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste here. I have one slide that talks about the features of common goblinoids, and yes, this is listed by latest appearance. So only the latest appearance of each of these monsters appears on this slide. Then I have another slide that talks about the mechanical features of uncommon goblinoids, again, by their latest appearance. And finally, yes, I have a third slide that talks about the features of the downright strange goblinoids. And again, those are all based on their latest appearance in the game of D&D. So we are going to flip over here now to this page here. And if you can see the number of tabs that I have open, you know that we're going to be talking about a bunch of these. Now, I mentioned that hobgoblins and bugbears are the common goblinoids, but 5e has given us a lot of variations of those to play with. Now, the bugbear, not so much. We have the run-of-the-mill bugbear, who is a CR1 creature, AC 16, 27 hit points. Then we have the bugbear chief, kind of like you have a goblin boss. You have a bugbear chief. Now, that is a CR3 monster, and it's armor class 17, 65 hit points. And these are just pretty much two variations of the bugbear, one a little bit tougher than the other. But then the hobgoblin, this is where 5e kind of just went a little bit crazy, imagining all the different kinds of hobgoblins. Remember last week when we were talking about how 4th edition gave us 5 or 6 or 7 different variations of the goblin proper? Well, in 5e, they give us no less, so far, than 5 different types of actual hobgoblin. And I say so far because, as you'll see, in previous editions, they have gone through and made so many different iterations of the monster manual, populating that with brand new creatures every time they print another one. So they're definitely kind of early in the life cycle of 5e at this point. It's only been out since 2014, so it's only 6 or 7 years old. So it probably has another probably about as long, another 6 or 7 years before they come out with a 6th edition of the game. And they're just going to keep pumping out all kinds of source books for it, including more probably variants of the Player's Handbook, DM's Guide, and Monster Manual. But here for the Hobgoblin, we have the run-of-the-mill Hobgoblin, which is a CR 1/2 creature, armor class 18 and 11 hit points. Then we have the Hobgoblin Captain. Again, a little bit bigger, a little bit beefier. He's a CR 3, armor class 17, 69 hit points. Then we come to the Hobgoblin Devastator. Okay, so the Hobgoblin Devastator is a spellcaster. Kind of like a Hobgoblin Wizard, if you will. And or perhaps a Hobgoblin Sorcerer or Hobgoblin Warlock, something like that. Armor class 13, 45 hit points, and Arcane Advantage. Can deal an extra 2d6 damage to a creature it hits with a damaging spell attack. And then Army Arcana. And then it's got spells up to 4th level. Then you have the Hobgoblin Iron Shadow, that one that we were looking at before. And this is kind of the Hobgoblin Arcane Monk. It's a monk with spellcasting ability and the ability to fight like a monk does. So armor class 15, 32 hit points, 2nd level spellcaster, so it has cantrips and 1st level spells, and uses intelligence for those, so probably wizard spells. Yeah, it does have wizard spells there. Then multi-attack, 4 unarmed attacks, or throwing a dart. And then the Shadow Jaunt, so it has the ability to teleport 30 feet magically, and along with anything it's carrying. And so that is as long as it can teleport into and out of an area of shadow. And then you have the Hobgoblin Warlord. So this is kind of the imagined as sort of the big king, if you will, of all the Goblinoids. Armor class 20, 97 hit points, and a CR of 6. So, you can imagine, now that you've seen these groups of Hobgoblins, you can imagine, like, if you're going to array kind of a culture of goblins and goblinoids and put these guys sort of in a hierarchy, you might have this Hobgoblin Warlord as sort of an emperor type figure, and then all of these other people making up different ranks. You'd have like a whole cadre of wizards, and then maybe these fighting monks, and then you'd have some of their generals, and then the various different companies would be made up of different types of hobgoblins, bugbears, and goblins proper. So now let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of the more rare types of goblins. And that includes the Bakemono. Now, the latest printed version I could find of this was in 3rd edition. And this is the Oriental Adventures interpretation from 3rd edition of the Bakemono. So it's this lovely guy right here, showing all of his teeth to us. He is a CR 1/2, and he's a goblinoid who inhabits the Shadowlands. Armor class 16 and hit dice 1d8 plus 1. So powerfully muscled humanoids with the intelligence and temperament of vicious attack dogs. So most Bakemono are too stupid to use weapons and really have little need for them. They leap to attack like bulldogs, clenching their jaws around anything they can catch, raking their filthy claws. They attack in packs. throwing themselves on an enemy fearlessly. And then here is a bit more from the Forgotten Realms wiki. Sometimes when it's difficult to find things, or sometimes I'll actually find the first reference to a creature by going to some of these fan sites, and then I wind up backtracking and going and seeing if I actually have the source where it talks about these. So it gives us a little bit about their physical description here, and their voice and whatnot, and the fact that they're mainly nocturnal and those types of things. So sometimes these additional I guess this is fan lore that's pulled from many different places, and you can see down at the bottom here, it'll tell you that they pull it from all kinds of different sources, including some of the really old source books, some Dragon magazine articles, and published adventures and things like that. Now we have, jumping back to 5th edition, we have the Koalinth, and the place where this was most recently brought in was in the Ghosts of Saltmarsh. So it's an amphibious goblin that is found in the Danger at Dunwater adventures. They're martial and aggressive aquatic hobgoblins with brightly colored faces and functional gills. They're known for their ferocity and for their hatred of elves. So this is yet another type of goblinoid, kind of a hobgoblin. All right, and then we have the Norker. And the Norker, you had to go all the way back to AD&D to find the Norker. And it's this lovely little guy here. And he's got an armor class of 3 because they're imagined to have an exoskeleton. So it's a goblinoid with an exoskeleton. The hit dice 1+2. Challenge rating didn't become a thing until 3rd edition. So before 3rd edition, you always see monsters referred to by their hit dice. And it says these are far distant relative of hobgoblins. Norkers are similar in appearance to the hobgoblin cousins, but they've developed 3-inch fangs, which they use in melee to inflict 1d3 points of damage. At the same round, they can also attack the same opponent with a club for 1d6 points of damage, but if they're disarmed, they have no effective claw attacks. And then it says, aside from the exoskeleton, which gives it a better armor class, in all other respects, they're similar to hobgoblins for AD&D. So that's yet something else that you can bring from the past and throw into your game, and just give it an updated stat block of something from D&D and say it looks like a hobgoblin with fangs, and it's got an exoskeleton. That'd be something cool that most of your players probably never would have heard of before. Okay, now we come to probably the last of the really rare goblinoids, and this one is a real strange one indeed. It's the Varag. This humanoid stands close to 7 feet tall when fighting, but moves and runs on all 4s. Has a hunched posture, double-jointed hind legs, and thick, sinewy skin. Creature bears a slight resemblance to a hairy and ferocious hobgoblin, but has a more primitive countenance and 2 curving horns that sweep away from its skull. It wields a cleaver-like scimitar. And again, now this is the what resource is this? This is the this is Monster Manual 4 from 3rd edition. So they had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different source books for the Monster Manual. And basically what they would do is every time they published so many new official adventures, once they got a sufficient number of creatures out there, they would just put together a new version of the Monster Manual that had all of those creatures that had been released since the previous monster manual. So they have a couple of different variants of the Varag. There is the normal Varag, which is CR1, the Varag Pack Leader, which is CR5. And then it gives you a little bit of lore. They're feral goblinoid. It reveals all humanoid traits. Varags pursue their quarry with unfettered abandon, fast and agile. They can sweep past an opponent, strike a deadly blow, and scramble away before the target can react. Varags are silent killers. Even when running at full speed, they're surprisingly quiet. They're chaotic and difficult to control. They're easiest to defeat when forced to stand and fight. And here is a picture of this Varag. You can see it's got this like very heavy bony head plate with the two horns that almost kind of look like an Angus or something that stick out to the sides. And third edition gives you different strategies and tactics for the monster, gives you the ecology for the monster, builds sample encounters for you, typical treasure, society, and then of course it always gives you, at least for the humanoid monsters, it tells you how you can turn a Varag into a playable character class or a character race. All right, and now we come into the downright strange Goblinoids. And the first one is a Barghest. And a Barghest gets the Goblinoid tag, but it's also a fiend. And so, fiend as in demonic? Absolutely fiend as in demonic. This guy is a CR4 creature. He's large. He's a shape changer. He has armor class 17 and 90 hit points. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this character when we talk about Goblin religion. But the primary Goblin deity is a character called Maglubiet. And he, at one time, bargained with the general of Gehenna, Gehenna being one of the planes of the Abyss, for aid. And the general provided Yugalos that died to serve the cause of the Goblin God. But when the time came to honor his part of the compact, Maglubiet reneged on the deal. As an act of vengeance, the general of Gehenna created the soul-devouring Barghest to devour Goblinoid souls and deprive Maglubiet of troops for his army in the afterlife. So, the Barghest is born to goblin parents just like a normal offspring. The creature emerges in the form of a goblin, then develops the ability to assume its true form, that of a large fiendish canine. And the mission of every Barghest implanted by the General of Gehenna is to consume 17 Goblinoid souls by devouring the bodies of those it kills. Souls consumed in this way are prevented from joining Maglubiet's forces in Acheron. And the number 17 is because that's how many oaths Maglubiet broke in his compact with the general. So that is like a really, truly bizarre and kind of terrifying form of a Goblinoid. You definitely would want to probably have that be a feature somewhere if you're doing a campaign where goblins feature as the antagonist. Throw a few Barghests in there, especially as your characters are getting kind of towards the end of Tier 1 or maybe beginning of Tier 2, and just make them wonder what the hell kind of campaign you're running here when you throw demonic goblinoid demons that devour the souls of goblins. Now we have another one that is tied to goblin religion, and this is called the Nilbog. And this one has a really interesting kind of origin story as well. So when Maglubiet conquered the goblin gods, he intended to leave only, all right, I'm going to butcher this name, Kurgorbieg. Maglubiet conquered the goblin gods. He intended to leave only Kurgorbieg as a harsh overseer who keeps the goblins under heel. But the pantheon included a trickster deity who was determined to get the last laugh. This trickster deity's essence was shattered by Maglubiet, but the god survives in splintered form as a possessing spirit that arises when goblinoids form a host, causing disorder in the ranks unless it is appeased. Goblins do not have a name for the deity and do not want to give it one, in case Maglubiet should use its name to ensnare and crush it as he did their other deities. They call the possessing spirit and the goblin possessed by it a Nilbog, or goblin spelled backwards, and they revel in the fear that a Nilbog sows among the ranks of bugbears and hobgoblins in their host. And so basically what this Nilbog does is it goes around playing pranks and making jokes of the higher ups within the society of goblins, and yet the bugbears and the hobgoblins are terrified of Nilbogs because they believe that if they don't show respect to it, that Maglubiet will punish them, and that they will be utterly destroyed. So that is another kind of really strange variant of a goblinoid. All right, then we have one of my favorites. We have the Thule, and you have to go all the way back to original D&D to find references to the Thule. This is a 3-hit dice monster with armor class of 6, and it says, the first line, it says, "These creatures are not undead." Well, why would it say that? Well, because a Thule is a magical combination of a ghoul, a hobgoblin, and a troll. So except when very close, Thules look exactly like hobgoblins and are sometimes found as part of the bodyguard of a hobgoblin king or a chaotic ruler. The touch of a Thule will paralyze in the same way that the touch of a ghoul will, and if it's damaged, a Thule will regenerate 1 hit point per round as long as it's alive, because it has a cross with a troll. Now, remember how I said that some goblinoids are the result of wizard meddling? Exhibit A, right here. Tell me how this is the result of anything other than some super powerful wizard meddling with things that probably are best left alone. Now, I also went out and looked at some other information on this, and there are several references here to this, and I don't have any of the references except for the Rules Cyclopedia that kind of collected all the rules from the original edition of the game. They're humanoid species from D&D. They're crossbreed of magical origins. The origin story is a topic of much discussion. One common theory chalks their creation up to a mistake. And their first appearance in print. Oh, now this is actually kind of a clever mistake that the actual company TSR made. Their first appearance in print was in an introductory mini-module included with an early D&D box set. They were intended to be a pair of ghouls, but showed up as Thules due to a typo. So TSR received inquiries as to what exactly a Thule was and made up the creature on the spot, or at least that's one story about it. Thule was most recently showcased in the Zeitgeist Games D20 publication Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, where it was updated to the D20 rule systems and incorporated into Blackmoor campaign setting. So, if you can find a copy of that Dave Arneson's Blackmoor from 2004, which is probably available on the DM's Guild or on Drive-Thru RPG, then you could probably find at least the updated D20 stats for that monster if you wanted to do that. Otherwise, you can do what I do, which is 3 hit dice. That'd probably be about a CR1 creature, and then just go through and find some appropriate CR1 humanoid, call it a Thule, give it the properties that it says it has, and be done with it. And otherwise, just use the stat block of an existing monster. All right, now, the last one we're going to look at, super weird. This is the Worghest. It is a plain-touched native outsider descending from the breeding of goblins and Barghests. Okay, you remember those Barghests that we talked about that devour Goblinoid souls? Well, what if one of them actually bred with an actual goblin? If that happened, then you'd get a Worghest. So they live as feared and respected warriors in orc and goblin tribes. They're descended from Barghest and goblins. Ability to consume other humanoids with their Barghest ancestors. They also have limited shape change ability to be able to turn into a wolf. And there is an official source book out there. I don't have it in my collection. It's called The Lost Empires of Faerun from 2005, and that is apparently where this monster appears. That was a 3rd edition source book. So you have all of these different types of goblinoids. And there's 2 types of bugbears, 5 types of hobgoblins. So we're up to 7. 4 more types of rare goblins, and then 4 types of really super creepy. So that's 15 different types of goblinoids that you can put together and help to fill out your society. Now, we haven't even talked about, and I don't know if I'm going to really have time to go into other than maybe just referencing them in our last episode of this series, all of the different types of creatures that control goblins or enslave goblins or use goblins as kind of their foot soldiers. So this just gives you a little glimpse as to how you can begin to, create this whole, at least, first part of your campaign without having to go outside of any driving antagonist other than some form of goblinoid. And because you now have all this lore, the connecting things like the Barghest and the Nilbog to the deities of the goblins, oh boy, now you can really start to see how there's such a rich history and a rich tapestry of all goblinoid kind that you can use when you're building up a campaign. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go back to our slides here. All right, so in fact, we talk about that that Goblinoid culture, religion, and their deities. We're going to look at that next week in part 3 of our series on goblins. Then in part 4, we're going to take a look at the different types of goblins from other IPs. And why would we do that? Well, it's just to give you ideas of, or to remind you that, at your table, your rules with D&D, you can flavor goblins any way you want to. So we're just going to kind of look at the some of the common traits that goblins have when you go outside of the D&D franchise. So we'll talk a little bit about how goblins appear in Warcraft, how they appear in Magic the Gathering, goblins from fantasy like Middle Earth, then goblins from other types of MMOs like Elder Scrolls, EverQuest, and some of those other games, and talk a little bit about the qualities and the features that each one of those have. That'll be part 4. And then part 5, we will look at how you could build an entire campaign around Goblinoid enemies. Maybe imagining a world in which there is like an entire Goblinoid empire. And that is the, primary antagonist for your heroes as they start their adventuring career. And then if you imagine that as an empire, well then, what is propping up and supporting that empire, and what are the powers that rule over that empire, and what's behind those powers that gives them their power. And so all of those can be things that you can have when you're looking at building a campaign-worthy adversary that's going to be with you from level 1 all the way to level 20. All right. So I'm going to look at the... Okay. All right. So I don't see any questions right now in the chat, but what I will do is I'll go into the wrap-up, and then I'll come back and look to see if there are any questions. All right, so this has been our second episode on Goblinoids, and as you've seen, we have several more to come. You can check out the other live streams that I do each week. Walker of Waterdeep is normally on Sunday. We didn't have a game yesterday, and that was my fault. I didn't sleep very well over the weekend, and I was feeling kind of bad, so I just had to take the day off because I was not up to running a game yesterday afternoon. But then on Thursday evenings at 8 o'clock, we do the Sword Coast Chronicles, and then Saturday night, we actually finished up the adventure proper for the Lost Mine of original D&D, and the players are going to have some decisions to make. They've pretty much decided they don't want to continue that storyline, but they seem to be a little split as to whether they want to continue those characters and that rule set, or whether they want to do something else. So we will probably have a session on Saturday, and that session, at least part of it, will be sort of an epilogue to allow each player to tell what happens to their character with their share of the treasure after they finish the Lost Mine of original D&D. And then it'll begin a planning, a series of planning sessions where the players sort of give me the idea of what they'd like to do long term, and then if that's something that lends itself to being able to pick up and play some existing content that I can fairly easily spin up, that'll be great. If it's something that they want to explore more of a completely homebrew, well then we might wind up doing another sort of short game between now and the time we start that. But my plan is we probably will continue to play games on Saturday evening. All right, so you can find me otherwise, or you can find all that live stream stuff on Twitch, twitch.tv/Gallibond. all of the archives of Monster Monday and all the other streams I do, as well as other content, is available on YouTube. And then if you really want to support what we're doing and help out, we do have a Patreon. Okay, let me see if there's any questions. Okay. All right. Well, hey, Skyline. Glad you're looking forward to seeing the rest of it. Hopefully it will be interesting and give you some ideas. And remember that even if you're thinking, wow, I wouldn't really want to do this with Goblinoids, if you just think about, okay, what's your favorite monster? And what would you like to be able to build a campaign around? Looking at how they have dissected, and subdivided all the different kinds of Goblinoids, that should give you license as a DM to begin doing the same thing with your favorite monster. So, maybe the favorite monster you like is normally like a CR8 monster. Well, there's no reason there couldn't be variants of that monster that go all the way down to CR1 or maybe even CR1/2, and then other types of that monster that go all the way up to, CR 15, 16, 18, or 20 even. It's just, if you look at the way they have repackaged, reskinned, given different kinds of abilities to all these creatures we consider Goblinoids, you can do the same thing to any other type of creature that you want. And that's really one of the things that I would like to do, is for people that aren't all that experienced and maybe don't feel up to the task of sort of creating an entire world or an entire multiverse from whole cloth, the way that, people like maybe Matthew Colville or Matt Mercer have done. Maybe you can take parts of things that already exist and then give your own spin to them and make them something completely new and different that only your players will ever get to experience, because it came out of your head. So that is the kind of thing that I'm hoping I'll be able to help people do with a series like this. Is just look at something that you may think and then once you start digging into it and pulling it apart, realizing all the possibilities that are there. Okay, well, that is going to do it. And I want to thank you guys for hanging out tonight. Appreciate you being here. If you are watching this during the week on YouTube, please, down in the comments below, leave any questions that you have for future parts of this. I check the comments every day on YouTube and look to see if anybody has questions or ideas or things about what they'd like to see for monsters in the future. But especially with this one, since there's so much to unpack, if there's something you want to make sure that we cover, please leave a question, and I will try to fit it into one of the later episodes in this series. Okay, that's going to do it. Talk to you guys later, and remember, watch out for the monsters under the bed. Good night, everybody.